You don't know what's happening in the OR just because of what's documented. And that's why you've got to have that next layer of analysis and really go in and observe. So you could have people bringing in all these extra items. So if you've got items that are brought in, they're not used, what's going to happen? They're going to get thrown away, or they're going to get thrown in a bucket somewhere and eventually, hopefully, restocked on the shelf. And that's time that's wasted. That's dollars that are wasted.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we're going to be speaking with Drew Preslar, Assistant VP of Advisory Services at HealthTrust Performance Group. And Garry, in this conversation, unfortunately, Hayes isn't going to be here today, just you and me carrying the torch, but we're going to be talking about data utilization. This is not an uncommon topic in healthcare supply chain, and it's certainly not a completely new topic of conversation here on the Power Supply podcast. But we're going to get into the weeds on bad data, validating that data, and some warning signs and strategies to help really improve that. But as we all know, it requires some change management and working with the clinicians.
No, I'm excited to see where this goes. Where's the bread and butter in your hospital? It's in the OR. It's in the surgery. And looking at preference card and data to support that, why are we not looking at it? This is the Pareto principle all day long in the hospital system. Reducing our length of stay, reducing those unwanted costs that we shouldn't be having on some of the items that are in the surgery. So I'm looking forward to seeing what Drew has to say today. So looking forward to it. Drew Preslar.
All right. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Garry Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
All right. Today we are speaking with Drew Preslar, Assistant Vice President of Advisory Services at HealthTrust Performance Group. And we're going to be talking about data. And it's not like data in the world of supply chain is a new conversation, but we're going to get a little bit more detailed around bad data and how to validate that data. We've never dialed in just that way here on the Power Supply podcast. So, Drew, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to dig into this with you guys.
So, Drew, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, maybe something you like to do in your free time?
Sure. So I've been with HealthTrust here about 8 years, been in healthcare my whole career. Started out on the IT side, did that for about 4 years, and got into consulting after business school with another advisory group, and then switched over to HealthTrust. Free time, gosh, I like to, I'll share my undergrad and business school degree, both with Duke. So anytime I can catch a Duke basketball game, Duke football game, something like that, that's always something for me to look forward to. Last year was a little bittersweet, that last season with Coach K.
Yeah.
But I think we're doing all right. I think we got somebody good here with Shire, so we'll see where the future
goes.
Well,
UNC is struggling a little bit this season after being ranked number 1, so that's got to make you feel a little good.
You know, I have to be careful because I've got a lot of family who are Carolina fans. So on the inside, I can't help but be a little bit happy. But when I'm around them, I do try to be a little bit more sensitive, especially
Well, my sister is about to return to UNC as a professor, which is where she got her PhD. And so I know she doesn't listen to this episode or this podcast, but she listens to some of the others. So if I'm going to do it, this is the place to do it.
Well, Drew, you and I might have to take a little side bet to see who goes further, since my back door is Gonzaga right here, baby. So we might have to just see where this goes and have a little conversation later. So this will be good.
I think I'd take Duke on that bet.
Okay. Well, we're on. We're on. This is great. This is great.
All right. Well, I said something about bad data and validation, but really it's all in the context of data utilization. And so, Drew, let's start off. When we're talking about data utilization, what are some of the challenges? Obviously, I buried the lead on that one, but
That's all right. That's all right. So we've been working recently on looking at preference cards and looking at the data related to that. And I think that's, kind of where this idea came from. You can do a lot of work with the data to figure out what's being used on the procedures. Well, actually, let me clarify. You can see what's being documented. The question is that's really what's being used? We'll compare that documentation data to what's on the preference card. And we can do a lot of things, and we can talk about that later, to compare what's being used to what's on the cards to make some recommendations to improve that. But the question, I guess, going back to your question is, is it really being used or not? Are people just dropping charges based off of what's on the card? And then are people making recommendations and assumptions around that documentation, thinking that it's actually used?
So, Drew, you and I talked a little bit before this interview, and you were kind of giving me an example related back to those preference cards, and that you found that about 70% of them were unused. And so that really kind of presents a challenge, right? Are they unused because we should pull them out and they're really unused? Or is this another example of that bad data?
I think in that case, it was a lot of items that were missing on the documentation. When we first did that analysis, and you see that it was 70% of the items on these cards, and we looked at probably, 40 or 50 cards, and it was anywhere from 60 up to 80% on average for each card of items that needed to be removed. And that's just not right. I can't imagine that there are preference cards that are that bad across the board. So the question then was, well, what happened? And so we had to go back and dig in a little bit more and figure out, were we missing data? Was there, something to do with the way they were documenting that it just wasn't showing up? And so we've had some other conversations and working on validating that. But, if you act on that, right, and that goes back to our previous point, if you just act on the data, assuming that it's right, that that's what they're using, then you're going to make a bad situation a whole lot worse.
Drew, just for our listeners who are listening to this, when we talk about preference cards and what the procedure looks like, where does it start? Where does it start? And where does it stop? Are we talking about all the way to a robot? Are we talking all the way to the implant? Maybe give a little more detail on that, just for our listeners to understand what we're talking about. A little bit of help there.
Sure. We're really looking at all of the med-surg supplies, so not so much the implants, but it would include robotic supplies. Those are usually part of that analysis when we're looking at it.
So it could be all the way to custom packs. It could be all the way to whatever is needed to be opened for the procedure to take care of that patient and the mission, correct?
Right. It's everything that's going to be used on that case, short of the implants and drugs.
Anesthesia would be outside of that parameter. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So, Drew, what are the implications here, right? We're talking about validation and bad data, and you gave that example about 70% of the preference card items that were unused, but we really speak to all different levels. I think senior leadership in supply chain is all too well aware of the implications, and it can be a major frustration. But then there may even be clinicians that are listening to this podcast, or there could be, other people that are newer to the industry. And I really want to paint this bigger picture. Garry gave us the foundation. Now let's take a high level. When you have that bad data and it's not validated, what are some of the things that happen to the whole organization that really make it difficult for them to implement a successful strategy?
Yeah, so there's a few things. The first thing is, if you really are missing that many items on a case, then you're missing charges. Now, a lot of procedures are going to be reimbursed based off of, the DRG, but there are specific items, and depending on your contracts with your payers, there could be specific line items that you're not going to get reimbursed for. So you're losing money right there on the reimbursement. The second thing is you don't have information to make decisions with. So if you really want to compare utilization and understand what's going on with your costs, if you don't have that documentation, then you're not going to be able to make a good comparison. So for example, we've seen in some procedures where the average cost per case, you look across different surgeons doing the same procedure. One may have $800 worth of supply costs. The other's got $1,800 worth of supply cost. Going back to that DRG, they're all getting reimbursed the same thing. So you got different margins across each of those surgeons. So if you don't know what they're using, then you can't go back and have a discussion and dig deeper to understand what are their outcomes. Is it worth spending that extra money to have better outcomes, quicker recovery time, lower infection rates, all those things. So it's really important to have the information so you can make some of those strategic decisions.
It's really interesting too, because you might have false reporting about which surgeon's performing really with the best margin too, right? Because if you're not capturing that data, this one surgeon might be kind of puffing up their chest about how well they're doing. And in fact, they could be the one with the lowest margin, right? Like if they're focused on outcomes, that's one thing. But if you're talking about cost per procedure, this really does need to be very accurate, and surgeons are competitive. If you want to utilize data to really help impact, how surgeons make decisions, the worst thing you can do is come to them with bad data, right?
Absolutely. They know what they use. And if you go there and you try to have a conversation with them saying you need to make these changes to the preference cards, or you want them to make a switch on products, they'll know if they're using those or not. And if you've got bad data and you're wrong, that conversation gets shut down real quick.
You're making me think of another idea about this. We're in the middle of a labor shortage, right? We're trying to get contracted nurses. And I think about that surgery setup back in the day, being in there, and you've got a circulator, you've got a scrub, you got a first assist, and you got the surgeon, patient obviously following the mission. There's some labor OpEx issues here. If your preference cards aren't accurate, how much time is being wasted? We always talk about OR time costing this amount, but if you don't have accurate preference cards, how does that impact the overall you're trying to turn ORs, right? We're trying to turn as quick as we can. Talk about the impact of that too with the staff, please.
Right. And that's one thing that you can't see in the data, right? You don't know what's happening in the OR just because of what's documented. And that's why you've got to have that next layer of analysis and really go in and observe. So you could have people bringing in all these extra items. So if you've got items that are brought in, they're not used, what's going to happen? They're going to get thrown away, or they're going to get thrown in a bucket somewhere and eventually, hopefully, restocked on the shelf. And that's time that's wasted. That's dollars that are wasted. And then on the flip side, if they don't have the supplies and you're in the middle of the procedure, then somebody has to leave the room, and that's increasing infection risk. So all of those things, really impact what's happening in the OR and make you a whole lot less efficient. So that's why, it is important to have good documentation, know what's being used, so that you can make those adjustments and update the cards, and you get the right supplies in the case when you need them the first time.
I feel like another thing that happens is we're always looking for technology to save us. And we've had this conversation on some other episodes that we've done. And I think one of the things that's difficult, especially as you talk about the labor, shortage, Garry, is you bring in a lot of technology, but then are we able to really maximize the value of that technology? And so looking at some of the causes, for this bad data, the first thing that kind of occurred to me, as you and I had talked before, but it was really the ERP. I mean, everybody seems to be moving to an ERP, and you can't talk to 10 hospitals in a month and not talk to one of them that isn't telling you that they're setting up an ERP. That phase may end pretty soon because there can only be so many more left that aren't doing it. But it's a very common thing. At the same time, are we really leveraging those systems to their fullest? How can they help us? Where are some of the gaps that kind of lead to bad data and validation just in regards to this trend that we're seeing in the industry?
The biggest problem I've seen as we've had conversations with different health systems about their preference cards is that they never did any kind of cleanup before they brought it into the new system. So they took bad data and slammed it in, and they still have the bad data. And on top of that, it's in a system that they're not familiar with. They don't know how to make updates right away. So then that bad data tends to get worse over time. And they do have tools, the Epics, the Cerners, they've got different tools in there and reports you can run. But, if you're not staying on top of it and you're not constantly going in and, again, looking at what's actually being used and understanding that in comparison with the data and then making the changes, you're never going to make those improvements. And all that takes time and resources. To your point, Garry, we always say if the preference cards are supposed to be cleaned up as someone has time, they're never going to have time to do it.
Right. And then, Drew, I always hear the question, finger point, whose responsibility, or Drew, maybe there's an opportunity to look at that from your perspective, but whose really responsibility is to own that? Is it a collaboration of people? You're just moving so fast, trying to get things done. It just gets further down the road and becomes kind of bad data. So whose responsibility? Help us out.
Well, the first step is to get it cleaned up, and that's everyone's responsibility. And that's a big project. That's a big lift. There's tools out there. There's, third parties out there who can come and help run these projects and do a cleanup. And then once they're clean, once you feel like you've got it in a good spot, I am a big proponent that you need to have somebody assign that responsibility. And they need to be coming in and having dedicated time to do that. Not, as they are free, not in their downtime, right? It's a day a week or, maybe a couple days, depending on the size of the hospital, and how many ORs they're running and responsible for. But you've got to have somebody who's dedicated to that. And they'll have to work with, if you've got service line leads, the nursing, obviously talking with the physicians, they're the ultimate person who's got to sign off on all those changes. But someone's got to be accountable for and responsible for making those changes in the system and making sure they happen on a regular basis.
So what are some other causes for bad data, right? There's more than just time and resources, dedication to managing the preference card. There's even more going on there, isn't there?
It's having the resource, right, that we talked about. It's clinicians, they're busy. So when we put extra things on them, they're not always going to go in and clean up a preference card, right? When they've got patients to take care of, they've got to get ready for the next case. They've got a lot of other things on their mind. And, if the process itself isn't easy to do, then that's just another barrier. So there needs to be a simple way to identify the change and a simple way to go in and make the change. Some systems are going to be better than others with that. But we really have to think about how do we remove as many barriers as we can from keeping those up to date. Because if you put a whole bunch of processes and cumbersome approvals and workflow and things like that, that's not going to work. People aren't going to do it. So really think about your processes, try to streamline that and make it as easy as as you can for people to, again, identify the change that needs to get made, approve it, and then put it in the system.
I feel like this presents quite a bit of difficulty for revenue cycle too, just from the standpoint of, all of a sudden you realize that something was used in a case, but you didn't talk about it upstream. And then you get to the payer and the payer says, just kidding. You should have gotten prior approval on this. It's not covered. And, the patient gets upset, and you look at HCAP scores and everybody's, customer satisfaction ratings influencing that. I mean, this bad data has a chance to weave its why can't I say the right words today? Really has a chance to weave its tentacles all throughout the organization. Like, this is not just a supply chain problem to deal with, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you think about that, your example you gave there. One of the things that we've talked with some systems about and have made some recommendations on is have someone reviewing those procedures. Now, after a case is done, you've got to close that chart out and do all your documentation. But, do you have someone focused on your high dollar items, your big cases, to double check to say, well, I know this case, we would always use, these 4 supplies, and go back and check and make sure. And then you've got to call the nurse who's in the room to document that. But you can put some QAs in place to catch those high dollar things, but it's almost impossible after the fact to go back and validate every single supply for all the items. So you've got to make sure you've got the right processes in place in the OR. And I think there are technology companies out there, and this may be a whole other podcast for you guys, but there are technology companies out there that are trying to solve that, trying to make it easier, but a lot of them are scanning based, and they're a little cumbersome right now. And I think nurses feel like it slows them down a little bit. But maybe someday somebody will have that right solution to capture all of that supply usage and make it easy.
Well, Drew, I'm a nurse, and I can affirm on behalf of all nurses that documentation is our least favorite thing to do. But, having been the education chair of my local AHRMM chapter, I understand how important this information is. And, from a business perspective, even as a business owner, you can't make good decisions and you can't run a profitable business without getting this data. I've seen about 5 of those solutions that you're talking about. And it's that data cleansing piece. Like, how do you bring value to the situation so that you can do the data cleanse? Because as you pointed out, the staff really isn't there. And a lot of the recommendations are, as you mentioned, let's put somebody on this, right? Let's create a role in the organization. The truth is the position either pays for itself, and maybe the technology does too if it's easy to use. So there's a lot of different ways to get at this. There may be people out there that are like, I think we've got bad data, but we don't really have that validation process in place, or we don't have the staff to assign to that. So we're not really sure, but nobody's really coming to us and saying, our charge capture is bad, et cetera. But the thing I know about being proactive is you want to catch those warning signs before somebody starts saying there's a major issue, because at that point, you're pretty far down the road with your issue and the culture and the processes that have to be revamped. So what are some warning signs that as people listen to this that could really clue them in, like, okay, we didn't know we had an issue, but we really should look at that? Because Drew mentioned that on the podcast, and I think there might be something there.
Yeah, there's a couple things. One, just looking at the data, again, some things that look kind of fishy in the data. That example we started with where there was 70% of the items, or, once you get up into that range, not used. That doesn't sound right. You've probably got a documentation issue there. The other thing is, on the flip side, if you're seeing 100% match, right, between the preference card and the documentation, you want to check that out too, because the odds that everything that is on the card is used 100% of the time are not real good. So are they just dropping the charges off of the card and saying, yep, that's what was used, and they're not going back and doing that charge by exception to remove items that weren't used, add the items that were used? So when you get on those extremes around, 100%, everything's good, to, we only used about 30% of the items on the card. Those are definitely flags in the data. And then just from a behavioral side, if you see a lot of items being returned after cases, you've probably got a problem. If you've got stuff just sitting in bins, you've got these trash cans full of supplies, that's not good. Or if you've got people leaving the room all the time, having to go pull supplies. So that's where you got to go ask the question, ask the supply techs, ask whoever's responsible for stocking the shelves, and then talk to the nurses and ask them, what's going on? Do you have the supplies you need? Are you having to throw away a bunch of stuff?
I'm totally thinking about this. I'm trying to wrap my head around this, Drew, and I start thinking about utilization from a supply chain perspective, like total cost of the med-surg supplies on a preference card. Here's my preference card. Here's line A, what it is. Line B, this is what we're paying for, right? We're paying for it. And then you go to the procedure, right? Then all of a sudden you say, this is what was used. This is what was billed. Delta becomes what's purchased is this amount, and what was utilized to that 70% of the details of a med-surg supply weren't utilized. All of a sudden that delta is not good. You're spending so many dollars in the supply chain world, and it's not getting reimbursed down the road. So it's not as easy to say that, but utilization, I think, is, how do you get to that, I guess, is where I'm saying, like, we're not trying to make it, keep it simple, Skinner or Justin Poulin, as he's the mentor of all mentors. But I just am trying to figure out to keep it simple. Drew, any ideas on how to get it there? Some people listen on the end of this conversation. So,
yeah, we've actually done some analysis around that, where you take the easiest way to do it. Hopefully, they've got a physical inventory. So you take your physical at point in time A, and you take your physical at point in time B. You take all of your purchases between those two periods, and then everything that was documented. So, right, your physical plus whatever you bought minus what you used should be your physical at point in time B, right? And it's
but
not
there's
always.
Going to be variance, right? There's going to be variance. So what is like a normal amount or this is different. I realize this is actually two questions and two different answers. What is a normal amount of variance today, and what should be an acceptable amount of variance? Because when you talk about like a really large organization, like the idea that you would reach 0% variance is obviously unattainable. So what's typical and what should be acceptable?
So I'm going to give you the good consulting answer, which is it depends. So it really depends on the item. And you got to understand there's some items that just aren't going to be documented. They're not, you've got gauze, swabs, all that little stuff that you're not going to do this kind of analysis on that. Now, if you're talking about staplers and implants and those things, it should be pretty darn close, because those are things you shouldn't be throwing away, right? And they're high dollar. So you've really got to think about what's the cost of the item and prioritize that based off of the cost, and then, understanding how those items are used in the OR.
So you'd almost take the highest cost and look at, what the impact is. And then if the variance is high, right, variance is high on a high dollar item, that's a focal point. And you can literally go right down through your preference card master item list and sort of sort it that way and tackle where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck or your effort in that case.
Right. Yeah. Because depending on which way the variance goes, you could be missing documentation, or you could be throwing that item away, and hopefully it's not the case. It could be walking out the door somewhere.
Well, Drew, this has been a great conversation, and we're coming close to the end of the podcast and the interview, but I'd like to leave people with some takeaways. And I think we've done a nice job of saying, all right, here's some things you want to be looking for that are going on potentially in your organization. Here's the high level impact of all of this, right? If we have bad data and the utilization and the capture, the charge capture is off, that this is really a very unhealthy position to be in, especially with people in negative operating margins today. So I feel like this is one of those call to actions that's like, What are some strategies to deal with this? Because if you're not already ahead of it, you've got to get on it right away. Just to be financially viable and to serve your community, this is an area you've got to put eyes on. What are some strategies that people should be thinking about that can help them move forward and really get their utilization to be an accurate reflection of what they're doing and really help them guide their decision making, to be pinpoint accurate with what's actually happening in the operating room?
Yeah, I always say anytime we're doing any analysis is you've got to tell a story with the data. And to tell a story, you have to understand what's going on. So you can't just take that data and the figures and the numbers that come back to you at face value. You've always got to dig in and figure out, well, what does this mean? And if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't add up, for all the reasons that we've been talking about where, you're missing documentation or you're throwing away supplies or you've got extra documentation that didn't actually happen. You've got to understand that. And that's the first step. Making sure that you understand what's really going on. And once you do that and you feel a little bit better about the data, then you can start talking about utilization. Then you can start talking about, all right, so surgeon A's cost is $1,000 more than surgeon B. Why is that? What supplies is surgeon A using? What's the outcome of surgeon A's procedures compared to surgeon B? And you can start making some strategic decisions and have those conversations with the surgeons about those supplies and think about, well, does it make sense for us to use this? Or are there some exceptions we'll make based off of particular patients, their diagnosis, their comorbidities, whatever, all those things that go into a decision that a surgeon may make around how they're going to do that procedure.
So, Drew, I know we got a few more minutes, and you've had some amazing comments to talk about this physician preference card utilization, but I did want to come back to the supply chain piece. Can you talk a little bit about contracted versus non-contracted spend and where that trend's going? Maybe to speak to that for our users to hear a little bit more about that. I'd sure appreciate it.
That's one of the other areas that we like to look at when we're doing this is understanding, what are they using? I don't want to make the vendors the bad guys here, but there are always new supplies out there. There's always new toys, new technology, and you have to understand when that's being introduced. And hopefully everybody has their value analysis program where they're vetting those products and making sure that they've reviewed that and it's an approved product. But sometimes that off-contract stuff sneaks in. And you've got to stay on top of that and identify where those supplies are being used and then figuring out, well, do we have a contracted equivalent for this product where we've got better pricing, we've got an agreement already, or, do we need to make a decision around that product? Is this really an upgrade to what we're currently using? And we need to have a conversation, get it on contract so we've got a negotiated price for that supply, and we're not just accepting whatever price the list price is.
How hard is it to tie outcomes to, costs of technology? It might not be new technology on the market, but it might be new technology to the organization, right? I mean, this I feel like can be extremely elusive because there's so many factors at play.
There are. That is a difficult thing. You can look at a few metrics, length of stay. You can look at, readmission rate. You can look at, maybe infection rates. So there's a few things and you want to identify those measurable metrics, but then it's always complicated by patient age, by, any other comorbidities, everything else that goes into what can drive that outcome. So it's not always simple to say these patients have better outcomes because of this supply, but in aggregate, as you look at the supplies and the items and things that are used, hopefully you can get enough data to where you can understand what's going on and what's driving that. You also hear there's practice variation. So someone could be using the same product and have different outcomes because of the way they utilize that product. So it's not an easy thing to figure out, but that doesn't mean you don't want to try and you don't want to dig in and at least try to validate your hypothesis that this product is or is not worth that extra cost.
Mm. All right, here's the last one. And I feel like this is the real, I don't know, golden goose in a way, but you talked about, trying to get that documentation and, the nurses that are working in the operating room and the fact that there are technologies that are trying to come forward to really help with that. And, how do we drive behavioral change? Because that's probably the number one strategy, right? Is no matter what you have in place, whatever the process or technology is that's in there, how do we get people to change what they're doing today if, we have such great variation in the actual documentation of the supplies that are used?
Justin, did you just bring up change management again? You did, didn't you? Okay, here we go.
I'm a big change management
Reduce
guy.
variance, change management. Good luck, Drew. Let's hear it. I'm ready.
That's going to be on a future podcast. No. I think that behavioral change, it takes explaining to the people that you're asking to do something different, why they should be doing something different. I think that's always where it starts. And whether that's explaining it through the data that you have, hopefully the good data that you've cleaned up and validated and observed, or if it's just a story around, the benefits to the organization and why they need to use this supply, or something as simple as, hey, make sure you document everything so that we can make decisions and we can have informed discussions around what's being used. But I think you always have to tie the why back to it. Because if you ask somebody to do something, but they don't understand why they're asked to do something different, most likely they're not going to. And some people may do something different just to spite you.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, when it comes to that change management, to me, where it almost always falls apart, even if it's a sound plan, like everything's good, even the communication plan is good. If you're not able to present the vision, it's really hard to get people to change. And I feel like sometimes we don't emphasize that enough, that, and you hear about it all the time, like, oh, that guy is not the best supply chain person, but he's climbing the ladder. Right. And I feel like he wouldn't really do all that great in an Excel document and really like lining all this analytics up, but they're climbing the ladder and I don't get it. I honestly feel like the ability to present that vision, especially outside of your siloed department to other departments that you're trying to recruit and influence that change, I feel like that is just such a key skill. And I don't know how you teach that, honestly. Like, how do you teach somebody to present vision to a large audience that they have to work with in an organization?
Yeah, that's a skill set that I don't think everybody has, but that's a great point. Where are we going and why are we going there? And if you can explain those two things, then you can get people to change.
And clinicians want to know that you care too. So you can present that, but if you have no personality and there's no passion behind it, sometimes the clinicians just don't want to get behind it because they care so much about what they do every day, at least in their minds. Like I remember, there's like a little bit of a martyr syndrome amongst clinicians, and I definitely had it. And, because I care more than I care about myself, sort of. It's kind of like the position you get in. And if you come in and present a vision, but you don't have that same passion, like I really care that this works, then they sometimes don't really feel like you're in the trenches with them. You're just passing on a task.
I think you have to always do it over food, Justin, because it's a serotonin norepinephrine release. It's a dopaminergic reaction.
Fair enough.
Okay, you got to always do it over food. So,
yeah, they got to believe.
Absolutely.
You've got to believe what you're saying yourself, and that should come through.
100%. Drew, great job on the podcast today. Anything you want to add before we wrap up?
No, just go Duke.
Yeah.
Come on, Gonzaga. We'll have a little competition, Drew. We'll see. I'll be good.
All right, that was Drew Preslar, Assistant Vice President of Advisory Services at HealthTrust Performance Group. Garry, we were talking about data utilization, but a lot of the conversation was really just around making sure that we can validate that data, that we can make sure it's good data. And even at the end, talking about the change management, it reminds me a little bit of the conversation that we had with Dan Pfister, specifically around preference cards and engaging clinicians. But what I really liked from our discussion with Drew was just some of those warning signs, especially like gaps between the P card and the documentation. I liked the strategy of figuring out, which supplies to focus on, and really taking that higher dollar item with a higher variation in terms of documentation and utilization, and really trying to figure out, all right, how do we resolve this particular situation and make it better with the documentation? So great conversation with Drew today.
Yeah, Justin, he's very knowledgeable on the preference card utilization and the bad data. I mean, it's the awareness. I think you brought it up. The awareness, Justin, of looking at it, and here's the signs of what's going into the surgery case and what's coming out of the surgery case, and being aware of that right out of the gate from a supply chain perspective. And that flows all the way down to rev cycle. It falls all the way down to rev cycle. Great discussion about it. The awareness, the change management, who the key players are, what we need to do to make sure that the data is good to start with. And the numbers they talked about of what these preference cards are good or not good, we've got to look at them. And it is the new norm, 2023. We got to be dialed in on this. So great conversation with Drew. Great one.
All right, everybody. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. But I do want to remind you to download our smartphone app for iPhone or Android. It's the best way to listen to the show. But if you don't want to download an app, you can definitely find us on any podcast application that you're already listening to podcasts through. That's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spotify, you name it, we're there. What we really would love for you to do, though, is to find us on LinkedIn and social media, comment and engage on our posts coming out from the Power Supply pages, especially for these episodes, because we want to get your feedback and we'd like to start discussion on what you're learning about when we talk to these really great guests that we get. And finally, you can send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. And on behalf of Garry and Hayes, who's not here, I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Power Supply.